Dr. Harris has posted the wonderful readings and the discussions. And which website have we posted those on, Dr. Harris?
Those are on www.solvingtheraceissue.com. And we have emails there already for the first 12 classes, the first 12 sessions of the big read.
Great. So for those of you who may have missed one or two, you can go back and literally hear them in succession. It's like going into the catalog of Prince or D'Angelo or Future or some of these musical art, Beyonce, that you would listen to a song later in their career and go back and hear the previous songs. That's possible. We want to thank our two readers today. We have the Florida A&M State University Takeover, the Florida Agricultural Mechanical University Takeover with Miss Asia Washington, who's joining us for the second time, and Miss Ariel Payne, who's joining us for the third time. She's our designated Wednesday reader, and I think now we have the two back together. They may be our Wednesday readers next week as well as we draw to conclusion. Welcome, ladies, and it's so good to have you here. Excellent. So, Dr. Harris, we can begin as you would like. And would we like to jump straight into chapter 6, or would you like to bring us back up to speed with what we covered the previous day? And then if we want to read from that very last chapter, I think it's 5.
Yeah, there was a little
jump into chapter 6.
Yeah, there's a little piece there. But for all of our listeners, I see we're getting a whole new group of populated people coming. So thank you so much. Just for a quick overview, this is the 13th day and of our book, Reading from Solving the Race Issue in America. And I'll tell you, folks, this has been one of the most eye-opening things. It's one thing to write a book, but it's an entirely different experience to hear others read from the book. And so these last 13 days, the last 12 days before the day, we had an opportunity to hear from some young people, some seasoned veterans. We've had a number of colleges, of course, Florida A&M University. We've had Morehouse College. We've had Brandeis University.
North Carolina Central University, Howard alum,
yes.
Hampton University alum, Columbia University alums, of course. And just to jump in here, we've also had a firefighter, we've had a Navy veteran, and we've had a welder. So we've had people from the trades and the academic arena, the Booker T. Washington School of Thought, if you will, as well as the Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois School of Thought. Dr. Harris?
Yes. And so with this great number of people and voices, we've started from the why for writing the book, how the political and economic circumstances, you might say pre-President Obama and then post-President Obama, where we saw a whole new spirit arise in our country regarding taking our country back and making America great again. And so the need for this book arose because we could see that there was so much misinformation and misunderstanding about the importance of the race issue in the evolution of this country. And not only misunderstanding, systemic, intentional, institutionalized misunderstanding. And so when we see this, you might say, this untruth about race and its impact on America really given a whole new life again. It's almost like we're going back through that 100-year cycle from 1898 to 1998, and now we're 123 years since 1898, the only coup that's ever taken place on American soil, and the same things are happening over again. And so we've gone through a number of points from the religion, how Sunday 11 a.m. is the most segregated hour in America, and how our churches have been the result of our division, but also a creator of our division. And we talked about the idea that the country was started, that when the Constitution, when the Declaration of Independence, when these documents were prepared, that there was a certain amount of deception and what would be? It would be illusion. And so I wanted to just maybe read this last section of Doctor's last piece, the original deception from page 82, where we are closing out the piece on how racism and slavery was ingrained into the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence.
Yes, and this is the section entitled "A Special Place in HE Double Hockey Sticks."
Well, no, we're at the point where on page 82, the original deception.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Right. So I'll read this piece.
All right.
Welcome, everyone. The original deception. This was the original deception on which the United States was created. It is clear that a number of the founding fathers, signers of the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, were either actively or passively supportive of slavery. Many of them actually own enslaved human beings. Some of these founding fathers presumably enjoyed the pleasures sinfully taken from the bodies of captive female enslaved on threats of whipping or death. In fact, it is generally accepted that Thomas Jefferson, second president of the United States, writer of many of the words that would become the Declaration of Independence, had 5 or 6 children with Sally Hemings, one of his favorite females who were enslaved. The other founding fathers supported slavery by silent acquiescence, as typified by the above words of John Adams. When we look at the historical facts out of which the United States was created, the inescapable conclusion is that America has always been willing, either actively as with the slaveholding states, or passively as with the other states that benefited from slavery, to betray its religion, its moral fiber, and its sense of right and wrong when it comes to dealing fairly with Black Americans. We see that the United States of America did not have a moral compass when it came to dealing with Black Americans. Do you care to discuss that one, Dr. Harris, or jump right into the 100th monkey? We can't hear you. You're on mute.
Yes, the summary of that piece was really pulling it all together, that the great, we have so many beautiful pictures of the founding of the country and how we were able to create this more perfect union from the subjugation of our country to the English king. But in doing so, the slavery issue was so critical to the definition of our country that it was incorporated not just by reference, by fact. And that when you really review this whole passage, this chapter 4, this chapter 5, we call it In the Beginning, you get that sense that the slavery issue was so critical that if that slavery issue was put into the Declaration of Independence, there would have been no Declaration of Independence. And this is carried through with the whole idea of a slave being 3/5 of a person. So just to reiterate that when something starts wrong, it's a seed. And if the seed is wrong, then all the fruit that come from that tree are wrong. Now, that's not saying everything that has happened in America has been bad. That's definitely not true. But it's like a garden. A garden has flowers and a garden has weeds. You don't have to plant weeds. And so because of the way America was formed, this whole idea of an imperfect union based on deception and really lies, because when you sat there, when the slave owners sat there and said, we find these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that was not true. So that is the context on which the country was developed. That is the garden in which we live. And this idea of solving the race issue is really about pulling up the weeds so that the flowers, the good things about the government can grow. Back to you, Doc.
Great. So now we will go directly into chapter 6, and Miss Ariel Payne will read with us beginning at the beginning of chapter 6. Miss Payne.
The 100th Monkey. As I reflected on the horrific treatment of Black Americans by white Americans over the last 400 years in America, I looked for a way to understand the thinking and behaviors that have resulted from this treatment. The 100th Monkey phenomenon provided a perfect framework for understanding what has happened to Black and white Americans over the last 400 years. The 100th Monkey phenomenon provides that whenever a certain finite number of a particular species have a specific thought or demonstrate a particular behavior, then at some point, all members of that species will be aware of that thought or demonstrate that behavior. The 100th Monkey by Ken Keyes Jr. The Japanese monkey Masaka fuscata had been observed in the wild for a period of over 30 years. In 1952, on the island of Kashima, scientists were providing monkeys with sweet potatoes dropped in the sand. The monkeys liked the taste of the raw sweet potatoes, but they found the dirt unpleasant. An 18-month-old female named Aimo found she could solve the problem by washing the potatoes in a nearby stream. She taught this trick to her mother. Her playmates also learned this new way, and they taught their mothers too. This cultural innovation was gradually picked up by various monkeys before the eyes of the scientists. Between 1952 and 1958, all the young monkeys learned to wash the sandy sweet potatoes to make them more palatable. Only the adults who imitated their children learned this social improvement. Other adults kept eating the dirty sweet potatoes. Then something startling took place. In the autumn of 1958, a certain number of Kashima monkeys were washing sweet potatoes. The exact number is not known. Let us suppose that when the sun rose one morning, there were 99 monkeys on Kashima Island who had learned to wash their sweet potatoes. Let's further suppose that later that morning, the 100th monkey learned to wash potatoes. Then it happened. By that evening, almost everyone in the tribe was washing sweet potatoes before eating them. The added energy of this 100th monkey phenomenon somehow created an ideological breakthrough. But notice, a most surprising thing observed by these scientists was that the habit of washing sweet potatoes then jumped over the sea. Colonies of monkeys on other islands and the mainland troop of monkeys at Takasakiyama began washing their sweet potatoes. From the book The 100th Monkey by Ken Keyes Jr. Thus, when a certain critical number of a particular species achieves an awareness, this new awareness may be communicated among others of that species from mind to mind. Although the exact number may vary, this 100th monkey phenomenon means that when only a limited number of people know of a new way, it may remain the conscious property of these people. But there is a point at which if only one person tunes into this new awareness, a thought energy field is strengthened so that this awareness is picked up by almost everyone. The implication of the 100th monkey phenomenon is that learning and its manifested behaviors can be transmitted from one member of a species to another member of that species without any direct communication or contact. Could it be that this same 100th monkey phenomenon might apply to human beings, and in particular to American slaves? Are there other documented studies supporting this 100th monkey learning and behavior modification phenomenon? Behavior modification experiments. The most well-known experiment on the concept of inherited learning was that of Dr. William McDougall, a biologist at Harvard University. McDougall began an experiment in 1920 to see if animals, white rats, could inherit learning. His procedure was to teach the rats a simple behavior, record how fast they learned the particular behavior, Breed another generation, teach them the same behavior, and see how the rate of learning of subsequent generations compared with that of prior generations. McDougall continued his experiment for a period of 30 years throughout 34 generations of mice. McDougall would place the mice in water maze, a pitch black tank of cold water from which there were two avenues of escape. One escape route was well lit and easy to find, but gave the mice a painful electric shock when they used to use it. The other escape route was dimly lit and harder to find, but gave no electric shock and provided safe passage. Over a period of 34 generations, McDougall found that each generation of mice learned the particular behavior, escaping from tank without pain, faster than the prior generation. The first generation of mice that McDougall tested took over 165 attempts before they could escape the tank, avoiding the painful electric shock. By the 34th generation, the mice could find the painless escape route in about 20 attempts. Other scientists attempted to prove or disprove McDougall's findings that behaviors could inherited and transferred from generation to generation. Inspired by McDougall's findings, W.E. Agar of the University of Melbourne conducted a similar experiment with mice over a period of 20 years, ending in 1954. Using the same general breed of mice, Agar found the same pattern of results, hereditary learning, as McDougall. However, Agar went a step further than McDougall in that he maintained another control group of mice that were never exposed to the water maze experiment, nor trained in any way in the particular behavior maintained by the test group of mice.
Thank you, Miss Ariel Payne. Dr. Harris, I'm going to ask this one up front. So I know scientists study mice and they study dogs and they study monkeys. Does that necessarily apply to human behavior? And what is your response to the reading of your work by Ms. Payne?
Well, first, all of the psychological experiments and medical experiments are done on mice. And one of the reasons is that mice are mammals, not that different genetically from people. When we really look at all mammals, they have a very, very similar genetic composition. And so, as with medicines, behaviors are often demonstrated in experiments through using mice. The advantage of mice is that they can go through a number of generations quicker. And so if we look back in the experiment, they were saying that in McDougall's experiment, the mice went through 34 generations. And so we're talking 34 generations over a period of a few years. I think his experiment ran about 4 years. With people, a generation is roughly 30 years. Okay. And so
some argue 15, and they argue 15 because a 15-year-old female could actually have a child.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Some argue 15 or 20, but I'm listening to your argument.
Yes. And so the idea is we use mice because it can go through successive generations quicker than people. So the same experiment would take a few hundred years to go through 14 generations, to go through 34 generations of people. Even at 15 years, at 10 years, that's 340 years. Excuse me. So mice have the ability to demonstrate these behaviors in a quicker environment. The interesting thing, though, is the behavioral aspect. In other words, the teaching the mice about teaching these mice a particular behavior by the reward and pain process. If you go through the well-lit exit, you get shocked. If you go through the dank, hard to find exit, you get food. And so the interesting thing is, like what you have this interesting assumption, well, do the mice communicate with one another? How do they? Well, there's a whole learning process that takes place on many levels: physical, spiritual, psychological. But over that period of time, this particular behavior is perfected in the mice. And so as we go further, we'll find that when we look at the slave making experience, it's a very, very similar parameters. The essence of behavior modification is pain and reward. And so whether it's a mouse or whether it's a person, that behaviors develop as a result of pain and reward. The behaviors that create pain, you stop doing. The behaviors that create reward, you continue doing. And so when you look at the slave environment, slaves were taught certain things. So if a slave runs away, if you remember in Roots, when Kuto Kinte kept running away, they finally cut his foot off, cut a portion of his foot off. And so the idea is that in the slave making process, you encourage certain behaviors in a slave. You encourage a slave to be docile. You encourage the slave to be afraid. Okay. And as a result, the slave develops certain behaviors. And so this parallel, and I'm sure that there will be some that would like to say, well, that doesn't apply. But the closer you look at it, the closer the application, the closer this whole process is applicable. So what I wanted to do there was lay the foundation that this process has happened in mammals. If you look at dogs, you look at any mammal, it's the same training process, behavior modification process, reward and pain. Back to you, Doc.
And I know that we're dealing with it from the engagement of those that were enslaved, but something to think about is the brute mentality, the mentality to be to inflict pain on others must have been, using your premise, must have been transferred from generation to generation as well. Ms. Payne, what's your response to the reading, and how does it kind of sit with you?
What the fifth monkey phenomenon reminds me of is this phrase that we used to say a lot as kids. Like when you would see someone mimic the action of another person, you would say, oh, monkey see, monkey do. And although that expression was said jokingly, I think it can really be used to further the African American community, the entire monkey see, monkey do ideology. With that being said, I would like to place emphasis on our need for Black leaders. Okay, we need to see Black leaders do positive things that will directly affect us as a minority in order for the entire race of people to progress. So that's kind of my take on the fifth monkey phenomenon, and how that can be applied to further our race.
And once again, I'm sorry, I got a little distracted. The notion that it can be utilized to develop leaders to advance our community. Is that what you're suggesting, Ms. Payne?
Exactly. I think again, the monkey see, monkey do phenomenon has been used as a weapon against the younger African American community. For instance, you see a lot of praise being given to celebrities. A lot of celebrities who promote crime and violence among our community. What you see is a lot of our white leaders uplifting and putting these figures on a pedestal, as opposed to empowering more African American leaders in our community. So that again applies to psychological warfare, where you're using a figure that looks like a Black child to influence them to do crime or commit violent acts, so that way you can imprison them. But if we turn that monkey see, monkey do ideology around, and we use that to better ourselves, we just need more Black leaders, is basically what I would like to emphasize.
Thank you. Very insightful. Dr. Harris, would you care to respond before Miss Asia Washington reads
Yeah,
our next section?
yeah, Ariel, you really hit the nail on the head, because the phenomena works either way. It works for negative or positive. And so that idea of monkey see, monkey do is so profound, and it's absorbed on many levels. And so when we see positive leaders, I notice now that so many of your commercials now show interracial couples, show Black men and Black women in different contexts, driving the luxury car, doing these other. And I think business is recognizing the fact that racism is expensive, and that if you can help people do positive things, they're looking at it from the point of view, we're going to sell more, whatever it is. But from a psychological and a social level, when we have people showing positive behaviors, as you say, monkey see, monkey do, those same behaviors will be duplicated. And so as leaders, and you really put the ball in our hands, because as leaders, when Dr. King was alive, there was a whole generation that were very clear. You had different aspects. You had Stokely Carmichael saying one thing, you had Malcolm X saying something else. But in general, everybody was saying, we need to liberate our people. We need to bring about a more free and just society. And people followed them. So leadership is critical. Just to digress a minute, there's a spiritual principle. I had a conversation with someone, and they were sharing with me, we were talking about the president, the former president. And her perspective was, one person doesn't cause all these problems. That it's not just the former president for some of the things that were going on, but it's almost a cultural phenomenon. But it's a spiritual principle. I like to think of the Moses principle. When you read the Bible, Moses, one person, was charged with bringing the children of Israel out of the bondage in Israel. And the metaphysical interpretation of that is that one person, one mind, one vibration is able to lead millions of people. And you see it with Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi was Dr. King's idol. Dr. King studied Gandhi's nonviolent approaches. One person, Gandhi, freed the Indian people, 1 billion people. You look at in South Africa, Nelson Mandela, one person, freed, brought about a transformation of the government. Or you look on the other side, you look at Germany, Hitler, one person, literally brought about, it was a cause of, I think about 50 million people were killed over the impact of the war. So one person can transform the world. And so, as you were saying, a leader, that one person can create a vibration that other people plug into. And the 100th monkey phenomenon says that when enough people believe and act a certain way, that belief and that behavior penetrates the entire species.
And when you were talking, Dr. Harris, it made me think of a candle. So one candle can light so many other candles as the light lit candle, actually the candle, the fire itself is passed to others. And we know that, Dr. King worked with other people. So he wasn't one individual, but he was a spark that others were drawn to and were sparked. And the behavior, yes, was passed along. And the masses moved us forward. In Nelson Mandela's case, he's the symbolic individual, but it was Winnie Mandela. It was the masses of young students who also moved South Africa forward. And we give the credit, the way history is written, we say there was this one lone individual, but in reality, they were working in a community of others. And the lone person, as we perceive them, were actually in relationship with a lot of other people to move the ball forward.
But it's so interesting that one person is still needed. It's almost like that one person crystallizes something that everybody else can harmonize with. I love that analogy, Doc, you were sharing about a candle. When you think of, what is it, Prometheus, and stealing the fire, that with one candle, you can literally light every candle in the whole world. Yeah, that is the idea of the Olympic torch. Is this one torch goes around the world and lights other torches to bring light to this whole athletic phenomenon. And so that's a beautiful analogy. So one person can be that light, and then they light all the others. The in reality is that a whole world is lit by thousands or millions of candles, but one person, one candle started the whole experience. Back to you, Doc.
We can revisit this one later. Can we have a reading by Miss Asia Washington at this time? Miss Washington.
Sure. So I will be reading this section. There were two rather startling results of Ogar's experiment. First, when the mice in control group that had no training in the particular behavior pattern were tested, they too learned faster with each new generation. When the mice from the control group were tested in the water maze, they were able to make a painless escape at virtually the same rate as the group of mice that had been tested and trained. Second, the learning rate of the first generation of mice of Agar's used habit of washing sweet potatoes, then jumped over the sea. Colonies of monkeys on other islands and the mainland troop of monkeys.
I may, does your reading say mice control group were testing the water maze? They were able to make a painless escape. Then it says second, the learning rate of the first generation of mice.
Yes, I flipped it over and it says,
'Cause I think there was a slightly different reading.
Okay. Yeah, it should be the second group. The learning rate of the first generation of mice that Agar used to train in his experiment was the same as the learning rate of the last generation of mice that McDougall had trained.
so
Now you can pick up that. In other words, is that on yours now, Asha?
No, sir, because that what Dr. Rogers has sent me with the file. This is what was.
Okay, all right.
So I wasn't. I'm not sure. I was just reading because I got kind of lost when Ariel was reading too. So
Okay. Well, where would you like to pick up?
Should I read the behavior modification experiment?
That one was read previously. I think we left off on, in other words, the learned behavior.
Yes, yes. In other words, the learn. Do you have that on yours, Asha? In other words, the learned behavior?
No, sir.
No. Okay.
Wait, it's right here, but so I'm supposed to read in other words the learned behavior.
Yes, start right there. That'd be perfect.
Okay, so because see, I was told to read after where Ariel concludes.
Okay.
So I got confused. Okay.
Thank you. You're doing great. Please continue.
Right. Thank you. Okay, so in other words, the learned behavior acquired by McDougall's mice at Harvard and Cambridge, Massachusetts, seem to have been transferred to the same species of mice used by Agar's thousands of miles away in Australia. When FAE crew attempted to duplicate McDougall's experiment in the Edinburgh, UK, he also found that the learning rate of the mice at the start of the experiment was virtually the same as the learning rate of the last generation of McDougall's mice. Crew's first generation of test mice could escape painlessly from the water tank in only 25 attempts. Slavery, an experiment in behavior modification. What if we look at the 100th monkey phenomenon and apply it to the training, conditioning, and treatment of the slaves, Black Americans in America, particularly during the 300 years of so up to the end of the Civil War in 1865. During the period of absolute slavery in which Americans were kidnapped from the homeland and enslaved by the Christian white people, there was a systematic program of behavior modification designed to transfer a Black human being into the inhuman parcel of the property of Black American slave. The training of the slave is very similar to the training of the mice in the experiment of McDougall, Crew, and Algar. Slaves were basically put into the water maze, a control environment, America. Slaves were trained to develop and demonstrate behaviors that were pleasing to their masters. The education process was basically the same for mice and slaves. Certain behaviors resulted in pain and even death, while other behaviors, those desired by the master, did not. The difference between mice and men, the American slaves, in these comparable experiments is that men are infinitely more complex. The impact of the slavery experience must be examined on the other levels than simple behavior patterns. The behavior modification experiments of McDougall Crew and Ogar dealt with physical behavior patterns. Let us consider the emotional and psychological patterns of a thought, behavior, psyche, and outlook on life impacted by the slave making process. We should find that the emotional and psychological aspects of being enslaved are transferred from generation to generation within the enslaved species, a whole regardless of whether the particular Black American was personally subjected to the slave making process.
And your response, Dr. Harris, to hearing Ms. Washington read your work?
Well, as I was listening, it is so, people are so much more complex than the mice. So when we asked before about using mice, mice can demonstrate, you might say, the basic behavior patterns. But when you superimpose the psychological, the spiritual, the emotional aspects, like mice don't invent cars, they don't build houses, they don't have schools. And so when you take this simple behavior experiment, and that's what this is a simplistic approach to slavery. But then when you superimpose upon that the psychological, the emotional, the spiritual aspects, it's much more complex. But at least as a foundation, it gives certain insight into the slave making process. And many times these behaviors, we may evolve in our thoughts, but these behaviors will often carry over almost subconsciously. When we speak, sometimes I've spoken with large groups and we have mixed groups, and I ask the people to look around, and they look around and say, well, what do you notice? And they notice that most of the Black people were in the back, most of the white people were in the front. They said, well, who told folks to do that? Was there a sign outside? I said, no. But this is one of these subtle behaviors that kind of develops. And unless you address it, unless you do something to neutralize it, it can be ingrained so that you just automatically do it. And so I know when we teach leadership, we were teaching a group of African-American males in public housing. And one of the things we were talking about was to be on time. In fact, to get there early and to sit up front. But to show how this whole racism works both ways, at one point we had an event and I had instructed, we had a speaker who was coming from someplace else, and the speaker was a white guy. And I had instructed all of my young people to get there early and sit in the first 6 rows. They did that. When the speaker came out and he saw all these Black men sitting in the first 6 rows, he was visibly thrown off. I mean, his whole speech, you know, it impacted him so much that he said, well, it's good to see it. He was lost for words. And so these behaviors impact white people and black people, but they're so subconscious that we don't realize it until it's right in our faces. I hope that was helpful.
That was helpful, and or until we are educated to the point where there's 100 plus people exhibiting the same behavior. And I think of, before we go to Miss Washington for her comments, I think of my years as an undergraduate student at NC State University in Raleigh. And when you go to your classroom, you sit front row center and you look the professor in their eye. You take notes and you look the professor in their eye to let them know, I'm here to master this information and to graduate in excellence. And so those who did, it became a part of the culture of being a student on that particular campus. Ms. Washington, what's your response to what you were reading that Dr. Harris had written?
Okay, so my response to it, as I was reading, I noticed that basically the experiment that they would do on the monkeys is kind of similar. Well, on the mice, I'm sorry, is very similar to how they would treat slaves. It's almost like slavery was a form of an experiment to see what it's like to dehumanize someone. So that's how I took it. And as for, you know, sitting in the front, I always prefer to sit in the front. I think I notice a lot of Black students sit in the front of the classroom because we don't have time to be sitting in the back and thinking about how we were treated and how we were dehumanized most of our lives. I feel like this whole section kind of made me emotional a little bit because, you know, we deal with so much and society wants to create a bad rep for Black people. They always want to put the Black person that's not doing well in the media, and they don't want to promote more Black people that are doing more for the community. Or if they are doing something for the community, we only hear the negative aspects of it. So that's my take on it.
And thank you for your honesty and vulnerability. You can tell by the look on my face, I was emotionally upset with it as well. Just kind of being stern, stoic to go through it. But I appreciate you actually, sharing that with us, because the reality is that, there were those who resisted. There were those who found a way to cope in the middle of an oppressive situation. And we are indeed the beneficiaries of those, techniques, methodologies, from code switching to, I hear what you say, but I'm gonna go do what I want to do anyway. So we found a way to survive and in many cases thrive in the middle of and after all of that foolishness, that experiment that you spoke of. Ms. Payne, what are your thoughts on this idea of, America is an experiment? I know often people say it today, the American experiment continues. But then when you add to it Ms. Washington's observation that, as Dr. Harris said in the book, it was an experiment in behavior modification in the treatment of human beings, seeking to make them um, inhumane, or to treat them in an inhumane manner. What do you make of this?
I definitely agree with that analogy that slavery was sort of an experiment to see how far you can psychologically and physically dehumanize another human being, actually an entire race. However, it was an experiment that had very real effects on our community, very real negative effects on our community. And that can be seen today. Not only did it dehumanize and make our race appear inferior to others, but it also put us a little bit further behind other races because we still don't get the same equal treatment that's granted to others, just based off of our history and the lack of education about our history before slavery. As I stated before, I don't believe enough emphasis is placed on the fact that African American people have had history prior to coming to America and prior to being enslaved. So I think we should definitely emphasize that uh, we suffer from a lack of connection from our motherland, and that is a byproduct of slavery.
That's a very good point. In fact, last night there was a special on PBS on the Black church that Henry Louis Gates, put together a video, and they were talking about um, spirituality in the midst of oppression of enslavement. And I was thinking the very thing you said, which is, wouldn't it have been nice if he had invested more time talking about spirituality in the African context prior to the interaction with Europeans when, Chinua Achebe wrote a book, When Things Fall Apart, when things fell apart for our community. Dr. Harris, what's your response to the comments made by Miss Washington and Miss Payne regarding this section of the work?
Well, I tell you, Doc, I'm ready to jump for joy because these young people have gotten it. You all have seen through so much of the mist and the misconceptions of reality and what has really happened and what is really going on. So I'm just amazed as I hear you speaking. It's like, man, this is amazing that young people and this really, it really inspires me now to know that young people are thinking like this. This is, you might call the thinkers move. They often say the thinkers think, okay? And when the thinkers think and the thinkers move, that's when change takes place. And so you all are definitely sharing the fact that the thinkers are thinking. The young people are not only are really hungry to know these basic facts, you might say the story behind the picture. And that not only are you hungry to know it, but that you have the facility to understand it and interpret it. Some people can hear it and go like, whoa, like that's a good idea, but it doesn't really penetrate into their thinking process that they can interpret it now, because once you can interpret it, you can act on it. So I'm just excited, man. Mm.
Good point, Dr. Harris. And I'd like to ask the two young ladies, you've been with us now for at least 2 readings, 3 in the case of Ariel Payne. How do you see yourself utilizing this information and the discussion to take action? Do you see yourself blank, sharing it with others? How do you see yourself using this experience as you move forward in your academic career and in your life for that matter? Whomever would like to jump in first.
Did you want me to? I'll go ahead and jump in first. So this is my second time participating in the Big Read. It really forced me to start having more conversations with my friends and family, and really just expressing more of what's going on in America and what has been happening in America. And racism has been a part of our lives since majority of us were brought into this world. And I remember I was reading my dad's birth certificate. I think I was just going through his stuff. I was just bored. And I was like, why does your birth certificate say Negroid? And my mom's a little younger. And I was like, why does yours say colored? Don't you, you're like more of a, it almost like made me feel like, okay, why did they say that about my parents? It's because they're Black. So it's like, what happened to just saying you're African American? That didn't exist back then. It was just you were either a color or you were a Negroid. And I just think right now, what I would take into this Big Read has taught me so much. And it's telling me more about speaking up about what's going on in America. I will go on a rant with anybody about this all day. So that's my take on it.
That's good. Rants are good. Hey, your six best friends are the questions: who, what, when, where, how, and why. And as you continue to inquire, of your parents and your peers and people you come in contact with, the more these friends, these six friends, will reveal information to you. And I definitely, Dr. Harris may want to respond now, or do you want
Yes,
to hear Mrs. Payne's? Okay, so
yes.
Dr. Harris, please respond. Then Ms. Payne will go directly to you. Dr. Harris.
But Aisha, I'm just, you pointed out something that's very interesting. We're the only people that have had like 5 or 6 name changes in the last 50 years. You know, when I was a kid, you were Negro, okay, and colored. If you looked at the water fountains in the 50s, it didn't say Negro, it said white and colored. Okay. And then as the beginning of the civil rights era, we became Negroes. Okay. And then as things progressed, we became black. When I was a kid and somebody called you black, that might be a fight. Okay. And then African American. And actually, we went from black to Afro American and then African American. And you know what it is? Many times when other people name you, that so often the media tries to find a way to describe our people. And so if you notice in conversations with white people now, many of them don't know how, well, I don't know how to say, I don't know what to say, what to call you. Call me a person. But this idea that we've gone through so many name changes over the last 50 or 60 years is just indicative of how this search for meaning and for identity, not so much from the internal from our people. I think we're always clear who we are, but this search for identity from the outside of how white people relate to us. Do they relate to us as Negroes, African Americans, Afro Americans, colored? And so it's a medium coming about. The African proverb, and I'm sure you know it, Doc, is not the name you call me, it's the name I answer to. But that is, as you were sharing that, Asha, thank you so much, because you really pointed out a truth that has happened in this country. And when you think about it, you go like, why is that? All the Italian Americans have always been Italians. All the Puerto Ricans have always been Puerto Ricans. All the Mexicans have always been Mexicans. But we're the only ones that had 5 name changes. Something to look at. Back to you, Doc.
Yes, and Ms. Payne, what's your response to both that part of the conversation, as well as how will you utilize this information moving forward there, academically as well as in your career?
Well, I would like to agree with Asha on the point that with this being my third time attending the Big Read, I can definitely say that it's made me realize how important forum is in our community. I mean, we've had many significant discussions here, and I think I'd like to say I've taken a lot away from it. Um, Things that we often on our day-to-day lives try to avoid because it's just so uncomfortable that we have to ask for basic human rights. I mean, but when you put uncomfortable questions up for discussion, you can really get solutions out of it. You can really get some progress going. So that's definitely what the Big Read has taught me. And when Asha shared that, basically her dad was identified as a Negroid just a few years back, it seems like it's been a long time since we've dealt with things like that, but it hasn't been that long. So that really reminded me that I had a discussion with my dad, and he brought up the fact that growing up in New Orleans, Louisiana, he didn't even get the opportunity to attend high school and receive his high school diploma because he had to drop out and basically support his mom because of how low they were paying African American women back then. So, I mean, just him sharing that information with me, now I have so much respect for him as a Black man for having to step up, and I just have so much empathy. And I think that's what our community needs is empathy with one another. That's why we have to come together and discuss issues that may be affecting us to this day.
Thank you again for that vulnerability. You know, for us to, just like the reading of this text, in many places it's painful. It's painful to read. I mean, you know, but in the when you think about the people who experienced it and the courage, you know, the spiritual will, the conviction with which they faced those circumstances, you know, from Kansas City morning to Kansas City night, but knowing that a better day would come and praying for a better day for their children and their grandchildren. And I think, you know, both of your mothers and your fathers and your grandparents and great grands for making the sacrifices that made it possible for you to attend FAMU, Florida A&M State University, and for us to be here with you having this conversation. Dr. Harris, I don't see any questions or comments in the chat, but I'd like to turn it over to you at this time just to hear your response to these two, you know, beautiful young ladies just sharing parts of their history that's painful, but yet they're turning it into power. They're turning this pain into promise for the future. Your thoughts, Dr. Harris?
Oh, yes. Well, first, on Instagram, Jeff Moffitt, Jeff has shared some powerful thoughts. He said, I'm loving the frequency vibrations in this space. Identity crisis syndrome. He had some good thoughts to share. Thanks so much, Jeff. This day has been one of the greatest days of my life because when I can see young people, Asha and Ariel, let me tell you something. When I can see young people sharing thoughts and insight that you've shared today, then then my life would not have been in vain. That spiritual, my life, that we know that going forward, there's somebody to take the ball. We're like a football team with a first string, and the first string has like been along so long that they're tired. Well, I'm not tired, but it's just good to know that when we pass the ball off, that there are brilliant young people like yourselves that can take that ball and run with it. So I just salute you and thank you so much. This has been a day for me to be re-inspired and elevated to just see the great insight that you all have delivered. And so, yes.
Thank you, ladies. Wonderful job. This intergenerational dialogue in which you bring in comments from your fathers, particularly, is rewarding to us to hear. We thank you. And any closing comments before we depart, young ladies? Asia first, of course, and Ariel. Asia.
Thank you all for having me. I enjoyed myself as per usual, and I'll see you all next Wednesday.
Fantastic. Asia, you're welcome back next Wednesday as well if you like for another FAMU takeover.
Yes, thank you for having me. I will try to participate next Wednesday. I should be available. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Harris, you've written a book that takes us on a historical journey, an emotional roller coaster, and it leaves us asking deep questions about why things were the way they were, how they were, what can we do to make them better in the future. So thank you for this powerful book and for this big read where we can discuss it with you, the author. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everybody. When we end the broadcast today, we've learned, especially for our participants and some of the people who are on the webinar, that once we complete the broadcast on Facebook and Instagram, we can stay on because we can then you can then ask questions and share some comments. So we'll do that. Is to everybody who's on Instagram, who's on Facebook, join us again tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern, 1 to 2 p.m. We'll be continuing along this vein Monday through Friday through the end of Black History Month, February 26th. Share it with somebody, www.thebigread.net. Go back and listen to some of the videos, some of the incredible stuff on our website, www.solvingtheraceissue.com, and you'll see a link there that says the Big Read videos, and you can listen to them all and watch brilliant young people as these two ladies today and others who've shared this journey with us. So thank you so much. I'm going to end the live broadcast on Facebook and Instagram. But those who want to stay in on the webinar, we can stay in and we can have further conversation.